welcome to the IoT podcast show. I'm your host Tom White. Today we have something a little bit different. We've got Nick Mills, the General Manager from Circle CI on the show. Now, for those that don't know, Circle CI is the world's largest continuous integration, continuous delivery platform. If anyone's involved in DevOps, you'll certainly be aware of CI/CD. We're here today to talk about DevOps, and I'm delighted that Nick's come and joined us. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
You're very welcome. Nick, could you start by just kicking off and telling us a little bit more about yourself, how you got into this position of General Manager at Circle CI, and also I know a lot of people are interested about your past at Facebook and how that came about also.
Yeah, sure. So I've been with Circle CI now for coming up to 2 years. I'm the General Manager for Europe, Middle East and Africa. So what that basically means is it's kind of a sort of mini CEO role within the region, running the spectrum of functions for Circle CI as a kind of business, if you like, as a subsidiary in the region, inclusive of go-to-market roles and other roles as well. I joined Circle CI primarily because I was really bought into the kind of the high leverage nature of what Circle CI is doing, which is obviously providing tools for automation and productivity for some of the highest performing and most successful tech teams within tech companies across the region. And I felt like we had a kind of really strong purpose, a really strong mission for the company, which is to try and kind of drive the level of performance to the highest possible level for some of these teams. Prior to Circle CI, I'd run revenue for UK and I at Stripe and a few other earlier stage startups, normally coming in at sort of Series A, Series B and building from the ground up, sometimes first on the ground or maybe kind of pretty early on the ground in the region and scaling things up from there. And as you mentioned, also I spent almost 4 years at Facebook running EMEA sales back in the day as well, pre-IPO through to the sort of early period, acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp and that sort of phase.
Wow, okay. Surely exciting times as well, right? At that point, pre-IPO at Facebook, lots of activity, I would imagine.
It was, yeah. I mean, I worked with some very, very talented people, and I think, particularly working at companies like Facebook, like Stripe, a little bit larger than maybe some of the earlier stage startups I've been at, I've tended to kind of oscillate between kind of growth to late stage tech and then going back into early stage tech. And in the larger companies, they've obviously reached a certain kind of critical size and had success and well beyond product market fit. And at that point in time, you've got great products and you're working with some of the best people in the world in their given fields. And it's really, I find it a great learning experience, very enriching experience to learn new skills and to learn from peers and colleagues, and very lucky through my time at both those companies to have a relationship with some of the founders of those businesses and senior leaders in the company. And then moving into the earlier stage companies, you can take a lot of that learning and apply it. Get very deep and very broad in a smaller company and kind of test those skills that you've learned in a startup environment. So both have a lot of merits, and I enjoy both. Both have been particularly fun for me, I think, over the years.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, the Stripe, everyone knows Facebook's story, right? There's a film about it. But Stripe, I might be wrong in this, but is it the Collinson brothers, the twins? Is that right? That started Stripe?
Brothers, not twins. And there's actually so it's two brothers, John and Patrick, who founded the company. They have another brother actually who's not involved in the business. Their story is that they were originally from Ireland. They actually are one of the people that have sort of genuinely lived the kind of the mythical startup founder story. So born in Ireland, they went over to study in the US, but during the course of their studies launched an original company which they sold, and they ended up I don't think they completed their university studies because they then came up with the idea of Stripe, which is basically in a world which is shifting online and digitalizing in almost all kind of ways, you can think of, whether that's like financial services companies, retailers, manufacturers of cars. All of these businesses are becoming digital and becoming software companies, and they recognize very early that some of the infrastructure for supporting transactions online, e-commerce, in an online environment really wasn't kind of fit for purpose. So yeah, they launched Stripe back in 2009, actually, during the financial crisis, or the sort of fallout from that period. And have really, their mission is to kind of create the economic infrastructure for the internet. Although that may sound kind of hyperbolic, because it sounds sort of quite a grandiose mission. You've really seen over the last 12 months both the increase in and the success that Stripe's had as a company, and its recent valuation that positions it as one of the most valuable private companies in the world at just shy of 100 billion private valuation. But also just the growth in online transactions. Even recently, retailers like Sainsbury's in the UK were talking about the growth of the online revenue streams since last year, and it just goes to show the importance of being able to transact online and have the technology, the software, the infrastructure to make that work and be effective for suppliers as well as consumers.
Yeah, no, fantastic background. I mean, if anyone wants to do any research on the brothers, very studious, incredibly well learnt, and a great platform. We actually use Stripe. We run the world's only IoT job site, actually, and Stripe is the main payment vehicle for that. So we know it and love it very well. But we're here today to talk about Circle CI. So some of our listeners will be aware of Circle CI from a DevOps perspective and everything that the company does. But for those that don't understand that from a technical standpoint, could you give a short overview about the business, please, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the best starting point is to kind of draw a contrast to how software was previously built and kind of delivered as a product and to end users. Going back, a lot of companies still today, in fact, will run in a more of a traditional way. But certainly when I look back at past companies I've worked for, probably before my time at Facebook, so maybe going back kind of 10 years and beyond into the past, the traditional methods of building software were very kind of milestone driven, using structures such as the waterfall model, where you set a long-term kind of program of what you want to build, or kind of roadmap of kind of product release features, and then you work to fixed releases, big releases, and over kind of fixed milestones. And what started to happen, certainly companies like Facebook, Google, Salesforce, and then in the last 5 or 10 years, companies like Stripe and others have really started to change the way in which software is built, and the kind of culture and the tools that teams need in order to reduce the number of kind of batches of work into smaller increments, so that you're not shipping large-scale change all at once. Instead, you're making small increments of change that, if there's a problem, you can fix it quickly, and you can enable your teams to move very, very fast and ultimately drive greater productivity. So with that kind of philosophical shift in mind, what Circle CI is all about is providing software to software developers in order to adopt some of those principles, move quickly, build products as fast as possible, get those products into the hands of users as quickly as possible. So, we are a software delivery platform. We enable software engineering teams to move from idea to writing code and then delivering that code to users as quickly and seamlessly as possible. To make all of that happen, we've got a deep and feature-rich set of tools. So it's all about building, testing, and deploying code, and then quickly and confidently validating that change, and then moving that change, shipping that change into a live environment where a customer would be accessing that product.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost the phrase, it's easy, once you know how, or hindsight's a beautiful thing. But if you think about waterfall and V-model methodologies, you talk about that now compared to an agile environment. It almost seems quite old hat, doesn't it, really, that you would actually try and do something along that life cycle, given the fact that things can change so quickly. And feature requests may come in, or something doesn't work, and you need to be flexible to be in order to make that happen. So, Circle CI is really doing fantastic work in that environment. I mean, given obviously the fact that companies are maturing their DevOps journey at the moment, and the importance being placed on test automation to ensure teams get faster builds, shorter feedback cycles. How is Circle CI in particular enabling that process and making it better for people?
Yeah, digging into what we actually do then to kind of another level. I think there's kind of three things to keep in mind. Firstly, it's that we fundamentally enable faster performance, sort of holistically for your team and through our platform and the kind of tooling that a company would use. So that's about building through a fast and reliable and scalable testing platform, the ability to manage increments of change in your code at scale and quickly. And then in order to do that, you need to have control over how you're actually configuring the testing and giving yourself kind of maximum test coverage and automating that test coverage so that you're not kind of blocked by an individual developer needing to then go and test some code they've written, wait for some tests to run, or have a lot of manual kind of intervention in that process. So having control to be able to configure and orchestrate your software delivery kind of lifecycle overall in order to kind of map that to the things that your team wants to, or your company at large wants to optimize towards. Some companies are focused on, in certain regulated environments, for example, there's a lot of kind of compliance, security, and aspects related to that are really important. Others that are needing to be very responsive to consumer-focused models are going to optimize towards speed. In an ideal world, you obviously want to optimize the way that your team is running to both speed and quality. Obviously, if you can minimize the number of errors that you have up front, then that's going to minimize changes that are required kind of down the line. I think certainly flexibility is important. That we live in a world today where you're likely to have, like, it's no longer that a change is going to be made just by an individual developer making a change to some code they're writing on their laptop and then shipping that code or pushing that code via a Git push into a version control system. That's obviously one source of change, but increasingly when companies these days are breaking apart their kind of source code into microservice kind of areas of the product that they're managing, where they're also relying on a lot of open source code. So there was a report recently which said that 40% of code living in companies' projects or products today is actually open source, which means that it's obviously managed by someone outside your business, external to your business. And that's only going to increase to as much as 80% by 2024, 2025, kind of mid this decade. There's a lot of change that's going to come from outside of your code base that's going to impact your product. So in addition to microservices and open source, a lot of companies are also using companies that are service providers like a Stripe or a Twilio or an Auth0 that are not just like ancillary services managed via API by another company, but often Stripe as it is an example where it's a core part of your platform managed by a third party. So if Stripe makes a change via its API, you've got to respond to that change. So for a lot of companies, but kind of almost now irrespective of the sector you're in or the business model you have or the kind of customers you're serving, that change is coming from many different directions, and it's almost impossible. You might have seen, the examples will be like Netflix or Amazon with the kind of the Death Star of microservices and third-party services that make up the products that they have or the platforms they run. For a person to understand all of that is almost impossible, if not impossible. So you have to ultimately automate through technology. And there's kind of material, obviously technical challenges as to why you need to do that. But there's also, cost challenges. I like to point out that in dollar terms, the cost of a developer minute is typically on average $1.65. But the cost of a compute minute is 0.006 of a dollar. So you could have your finite, precious, hard to hire, hard to retain developers focused on manual tasks, but it's not really very cost effective to do that. And if you have a developer that's needed to do the same task more than a couple of times, you should really automate that using technology. It's going to be cheaper and it's just going to scale faster, and you're going to enable your developers to do a lot more as a result. So, the flexibility to then build a platform that supports your business needs and automate all of that process, and then allow your developer teams to focus on the bigger picture, the products they're building, and getting more sort of value for their time is ultimately what it's all about.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I think that's got to be a take-home phrase there, hasn't it? The cost per compute. So was it cost per minute for computational and one for a developer, and the delta between those? I mean that's a fantastic figure, and for something that's really poignant. I mean from our side and some of the work that we do a lot. So we've done an awful lot of conversions of manual testing teams to automated, right? It's quite a laborious task to go about things in a manual way, and if you can create an automation around that, that's where the world's going. And you've only got to look at RPA, AI, machine learning, and this is why it was really interesting to get you on from Circle CI to talk about how this is changing the IoT world, because a lot of people are using agile and DevOps environments in order to release software and release changes to software in their IoT infrastructure very quickly. You mentioned Twilio, of course, as well. So Twilio is synonymous quite a lot with mobile infrastructures and what have you, and certainly from some of our clients using Twilio as well. So very much hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think what's a really kind of interesting thing that we're seeing, I say in the US maybe a little bit earlier than in EMEA, but certainly in this region in the last couple of quarters, is a shift in the types of companies that are using Circle CI, whether they're coming to us as sales opportunities. I've got a sales team in Europe that's 20 odd people now, and obviously we talk to a lot of customers that are just in the early stages of getting into CI/CD or kind of embracing DevOps practices. But the mainstay of our customer base has traditionally in this region been companies that have, as European tech and the kind of startup tech scene has exploded over recent years, we've seen year-on-year record increases in venture capital investment into companies that are getting larger and larger, staying longer through the VC life cycle as tech companies. Those companies have tried to emulate the way that companies like Google and Facebook and Salesforce and others build software, and that's been the kind of the mainstay of our customer base up until now. So that's been great because we work with companies like Monzo, Deliveroo, Babylon Health. We work with some car manufacturers that are doing interesting stuff to do with self-driving vehicles. We work with some really exciting companies that in part are certainly kind of leveraging Internet of Things capabilities, AI, machine learning capabilities, and they certainly need the speed and the kind of the advanced capabilities. But a big shift in the last couple of quarters has been more traditional companies that are now starting to recognize that it's no longer really a question of whether you build software, but how you build software. And the FT produced a report in January this year that said that this was a UK specific report, but said that every medium to large corporate was experimenting in some way with software-based innovation, and a great proxy for modern software development is using continuous integration and continuous deployment tools and kind of practices. And we're certainly seeing that. We're seeing financial services companies, we're seeing more traditional retailers, we're seeing manufacturers of fertilizers, we're seeing automotive companies that you wouldn't necessarily consider or wouldn't have considered to be kind of really high on the self-driving vehicles kind of market. All of them are starting to come to us and are interested in not just like experimenting internally in innovation labs or like one specific area of their business, but they're looking at it as a wholesale kind of shift that they want to move all of their teams onto much more modern, fast and kind of quality driven software practices, and they need ultimately the best in class tools to do that. McKinsey produced a great report actually recently talking about developer velocity, and they really highlighted that there's 4 things you need to do. One is to empower your developers with world-class tools. The second is to then create a culture of kind of psychological safety and a kind of culture whereby failing is okay because it should be part of innovation and it should be part of an iterative and kind of modern kind of culture within a software engineering team. And then, thirdly, you need to create a comprehensive product management structure that buys into that fast pace of release rather than locked into long-term milestones and kind of larger batches of work. And then finally, I think the other area that they referenced, and we certainly talk a lot about, is investing in the experience that your developers have in an developer-empowered environment. And some of that's career development, but a lot of it relates to using first-class, latest tools and technology, so they can really improve their productivity and enjoy what they do using cutting-edge tech.
Yeah, I mean it's a fantastic list, and I'd go a little bit further and say empowerment, accountability. Right, people should hold themselves accountable to empower themselves through what they're doing and through having that culture. We talk a lot internally about culture, and if you notice that the room's quiet, or if you notice that there's an issue, who's the first person to notice? Well, it's the first person. Who's the first person to say anything? It's the first person to notice, right? And to be able to talk about that, and to have this very flat structure of we all holding each other accountable to try and get the best out of each other and the environment. Well, in your opinion, I mean, you're very well spoken in this environment, Nick. But what are the crucial challenges then for DevOps moving forward, and how can Circle CI kind of combat some of these?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I suppose there's like three areas that would be common, but they're not always consistent across every team or every organisation. I think the things that I tend to look for, or we would certainly advocate for companies to focus on wherever they are in their DevOps journey would be culture. We just talked a little bit about that, but creating an environment where you get away from the idea that failure is a bad thing. It should be a good thing because it's a learning opportunity, and making sure that developers can take risks. We, as an aside, we published a report at Circle CI back in the autumn time called The State of Software Delivery, where because we work with a lot of companies across lots of different sectors, we work just in EMEA alone in 66 countries with paid customers. So we've got a really broad view of different types of businesses and fundamentally how they're running their software teams, and we track 4 key metrics in particular that talk about how quickly you can recover, how much throughput or productivity you drive, and how kind of innovative or how much risk you're taking in your business. And what we saw in the UK is that the UK companies generally have very high productivity or throughput. They basically ship a lot of code, move very quickly, but they also very rarely make errors in the code, which is, you'd think, a good thing, but actually that's a bad thing, because what we're seeing is that the success rate's too high for what we would expect to see in a fast-paced, innovative environment. So obviously, case by case, it always varies, but it gives cause to think that companies aren't necessarily taking enough risks, and could probably stand to give more kind of freedom and create more of a culture of risk-taking for their developer teams to kind of get that benefit of innovation. I think the other thing is like operations. So definitely I talked before about the needs to kind of break things down into smaller and smaller batches. We talk a lot about that, and that's fundamentally changed the way that software teams work by making that shift. But a big thing too in the context of operations is actually starting to in-house a lot of your software engineering. Traditionally in places like the UK and Germany, a lot of, and also more traditional companies in particular, have outsourced a lot of their IT and software development, where we obviously had a big kind of push over the sort of 15 to 20 years ago to outsource. We believe that there's still a place for that, but bringing things back in-house and investing in your software team, knowing that it is a core value creator for your business, is really important. And then, setting up the kind of the operational and kind of technological structures to support that team. So, what is the system and the elements of this system that you're operating to? What kind of tooling, are you going to use to kind of optimize parts of your system? Automating as much as possible, test coverage to kind of help do that. And then I think like the final area is we would always encourage companies to take a metrics-driven approach. We'd say a sort of mix in this region. Like some companies are really laser focused on one particular metric. We've got 4 that we published in our report that we think all of them have value, and none of them on its own really should be the one kind of key thing you focus on, but it does depend on your business. But first things first is to take a metrics-driven approach, try and clearly define what metrics are important for you, and then benchmark for you. It's useful using a report like ours to look at how you benchmark against other high-performing companies, but ultimately what's most valuable, and there's no one-size-fits-all kind of approach, it should absolutely be kind of tailored to the given team. What's most important is to baseline your most important metrics against your best performance that you're seeing, and then seek to improve that performance. So really kind of those three areas I think are the ones that I would recommend looking at, and they're often the areas that companies, depending on where they are on that journey, have the biggest challenges with.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. No, that's fantastic. And I'm curious to know where this is all going. So we started this show by talking about the traditional waterfall and V model approach to software development, and we look back at that and we kind of laugh and think, oh, how silly that was. Where are we going in the future with DevOps, and where is Circle CI going?
I think thinking about some of the trends that we see. One is we've kind of alluded to it as we've been chatting today. One is just generally the pervasiveness of modern software development practices, and I don't just mean software and teams building software, but the most advanced practices are becoming more and more broadly adopted. It's definitely no longer just for startups. It's certainly larger corporates, and it's not just innovation labs, but more broadly across organisations. Jeff Lawson from Twilio said something the other day that kind of caught my eye, which was that the landscape shifted from the classic build versus buy to build versus die scenario, which is kind of quite a bold statement, but I think it kind of emphasises the right point, that companies need to invest in not just software broadly, but the practices and the people that are going to kind of bring that culture to life in order to kind of really survive and thrive in the future. But drilling into that, I think there are a few trends that stand out. I've mentioned a couple of them. So certainly more open source and greater use of open source. Shift to cloud. We've seen that in the last year, where teams would have been running their CI/CD tests on build machines under a desk in an office. That's obviously not been possible when we've all been remote, and it's very doubtful that people are likely to shift away from cloud now that they've accelerated their adoption of it. I think increased use of microservices. That's the case for sure, and we're increasingly seeing companies adopt the idea that they want to use more than one cloud, so a multi-cloud strategy and even a multi-VCS strategy. So the combination of that is a lot more complexity, a lot of different sources of change, and so when you kind of put all that together, the source of change can come from anywhere. The need to automate the validation of that change through technology such as Circle CI and partners that we integrate with. And to McKinsey's point, that you've got to then invest in the best in breed technologies for your very precious developer resources, partly so that they are they're kind of maximizing their productivity, partly because they want to, from a career perspective, use the best tools, and thirdly tying that to business outcomes is going to be absolutely critical. Again, the McKinsey article I mentioned earlier, that really talked about the fact that the companies that invest in tools and some of these modern practices are going to have, and their data shows they will have the best outcomes for the company, for shareholders, if you're an earlier stage company, for your investors and for your employees. So I think the kind of the reasons are clear, and really the complexity is only going to get harder. So investing in tools and cutting edge technologies that help you kind of manage all of that is key. Final thought is we're definitely seeing an increase in best in breed and a desire for interoperability. So traditionally the kind of the approach of selling IT to the CTO or CIO, who then mandates tools across the organization, is certainly how in my day at Microsoft that was my objective when I worked there. These days we see even some of the largest corporates really empowering smaller teams or smaller parts of their organization to make these decisions and to move quickly. And we're even in the startup world, actually, we're seeing the emergence of a sort of in between, central IT purchase versus team empowerment. The kind of the in between, which I think we'll see more of and will certainly scale, is the idea of a developer experience team. So this is a team that exists centrally within your organization, whatever size and scale your organization is, that assembles tools, practices, metrics, acquires, manages your vendors, and kind of creates a sort of best practice, sort of best in class set of kind of principles and operational tooling and measurement that then will make that available to your product building teams as a service where we see that work particularly well is that's a centralized team that standardizes to a certain extent, and that gives you, scalability as an organization and returns to scale. But where we see that work particularly well is bringing that in, but still in an empowered environment. So a given team or developer could still choose to go their own way and use something different if there's a real kind of crucial need for the product they're building or the way they want to work, but also getting the benefits of standardization and scale through that developer experience team. I'm seeing that in some venture capital backed companies, also in some larger, more sort of traditional corporates that we are working with, and certainly companies we're talking to.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. The developer experience team, we hear a lot about centres of excellence when it comes to the new normal, about offices and what that looks like. And that, for me, that sounds very similar to a place where people can actually meet, code. You look at these kind of events that happen in tech, hackathon type events, where people are coding against each other. And it sounds like something that could be part of this new normal, right? This experience team, people joining and getting involved together to create maybe proof of concepts and ideas and how to take that to another stage. That's a really useful insight. Nick,
yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show. It's been fantastic, honestly, learning more about the company. It's really, really interesting. Clearly very passionate about it, and incredibly articulate the way that you've expressed this, and on behalf of the business. Where can people find out more about Circle CI? I assume social media. You're on various channels.
Yeah, absolutely. Our website's circleci.com, so we've got loads of information and use cases and stuff like that on the website. We are at circleci.com on Twitter as well, and obviously we've got a LinkedIn page. I'm on LinkedIn as well, and always open to connecting and love meeting new people and networking. So very happy to connect and answer any questions that people have.
Okay, you've said it now, Nick. You're going to get lots of connection requests. Thank you so much. Come and join us and give us your comments in the conversation that we're having on LinkedIn to find out more about DevOps. We'd be eager to see it. And as always, if you'd like to find out more about the podcast, sign up to the newsletter for the latest releases and blogs that we'll be putting out.